to Dr. Roxanne Harde's distinguished professorial lecture. I Knew What I Missed, Nostalgia and Resistance in Indigenous Children's Literature. This lecture is one of Augustana's special traditions. It celebrates the extraordinary accomplishments of individuals, those who have been promoted to the senior-most rank of the Professoriate, but it's also a celebration of faculty scholarship, of teaching, and of interdisciplinary engagement with faculty colleagues, students, and members of the community. These are all core values here at Augustana. They're in fact central to our mission as a public liberal arts university. So I'm very proud and pleased to be here. But it's also my job this evening to talk a bit about Roxanne. What to say? Well, she is simply extraordinary. The incisiveness, originality, and breadth of her scholarship are amazing, ranging from American studies to women's studies to children's literature to the scholarship of teaching and learning to popular culture to 19th century literature to eco-criticism to half a dozen things I've left out. Roxanne's also an energetic organizer and collaborator, which is clear from the 4 scholarly books that she has edited or co-edited since 2007, with the most recent, Eleanor Hodgman Porter's Pollyanna, Children's Classics at 100, having just been released in recent weeks. Roxanne brings the same energy and the same organizational skills to the kitchen. She is a master of the dinner party, always arranging with great care the right combinations of guests and the right combinations, and never just one soup or one main dish or one dessert of sumptuous food. Her skills in the kitchen are as amazing as her skills as a scholar. And I believe she loves and appreciates good food as much as she does a good book. One thing I've often told Roxanne is that she must inhabit a parallel universe, one where the days are 48 hours long, because there is no other way to explain her extraordinary productivity or the fact that she accomplishes so much without appearing to sacrifice at all her commitments to her family, especially Wayne, her parents, her daughter and son-in-law, and her beautiful granddaughter. Above all, Roxanne is a fabulous teacher and a mentor to students. Here's what students typically say about Roxanne. Some of them are here this evening. Roxanne is intense. Roxanne can be intimidating. Roxanne's courses are hard. Roxanne's expectations are daunting. And then here's what they invariably add. She's excellent and inspiring. I've never learned so much in a class. These, by the way, are all direct quotes. I've gained so much confidence in my own abilities, mainly because Roxanne has supported me to succeed. Roxanne sees the potential in students and wants them to achieve greatness. Roxanne is actually no different in her work as Associate Dean Research. Students and faculty who initially may find her intimidating soon learn how much she cares, how much she's willing to invest in their success, and the payoff is simply amazing. I'm confident the payoff is also going to be amazing tonight, that all of us are in for a treat. And so it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you my friend, my colleague, often my inspiration, full professor, Dr. Roxanne Harde.
I have no idea how to follow that. Thank you, Ellen. I want to thank everyone for joining me here this evening. It means an awful lot to me to see all of you here, students, former students, my family, my beautiful daughter, and friends, and my colleagues. You folks have set the bar pretty high here, and frankly, I hate presenting to you more than anybody else in the world. But here we all are, so let's just get going. I want to thank Michelle Pratt. I don't think she's here, but she organized a lot for me, and that's been wonderful. And Alan and Kim, your support in the whole promotion process and in my day-to-day life as a member of Fine Arts and Humanities and as Associate Dean. So thank you. So tonight has been a long time coming, and I want to take you through some of the landmarks on the path that led me here. And then I'm going to present some of my new research project on Indigenous children's literature. Alan's listed all the other stuff that keeps me busy, so we can talk about that later. But for right now, it's about this. I'll begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is Treaty 6 territory and a traditional meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples. The territory on which Augustana is located provided a traveling route and home to the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, and other original peoples. Their spiritual and practical relationships to the land create a rich heritage for our learning and our life as a community. In Yellow Woman and a Beauty of the Spirit, one of my favorite Native authors, Leslie Marmon Silko, writes that in First Nations cultures, I quote, "Human identity, imagination, and storytelling were inextricably linked to the land, to Mother Earth, just as the strands of a spider's web radiate from the center of the web," end quote. She notes that stories, our stories, my story, resemble spider's webs, with many threads radiating from a center, crisscrossing each other. If I've learned anything over the past 25 years or so, it's that everything is connected. The paths that our lives take, our ties, our commitments to communities and relationships, yes, but also our ties to place and the land are inextricably intertwined. So some of my story to start. 10 years ago this fall, right before I saw the posting for my dream job at Augustana, I was in the second year of my postdoc at Cornell, and I was teaching Indigenous women's writing and the oral tradition for the Department of Women's Studies at Queen's University. Queen's did not then, nor does not now, have a faculty or department of Native Studies. They've hived all their Native Studies course programming out to all the different faculties and departments. But I had proposed the course as a seminar for the department. They were very short-staffed at that time, though I had not been involved with it or any of its programming to that point. And in fact, Indigenous literatures had not factored at all in my doctoral work in the Department of English. Still, because I had earned a minor in Native Studies in my bachelor's degree at the University of Saskatchewan and had a long-term interest in the work of Ojibwe writer Louise Erdrich, women's studies gave me a chance. And I developed and delivered a course that I now teach as part of my regular rotation here. Now I'm going to take you back a little bit further to 1997, when I was working on my master's thesis on Emily Dickinson, but had somehow managed to turn my library technician, young adult librarian job for the Prince Albert Rural School Division into a consulting contract with 2 First Nations north of Prince Albert. For 16 glorious months, I immersed myself in Emily Dickinson's examinations of faith for half my day. And then I spent the other half of the day building from the ground up the library for the soon-to-be-opened Little Red River School. A joint effort of the Montreal Lake and Lac La Ronge Cree First Nations, the school is K-12, and from the air it's shaped like an eagle. I selected the books, I cataloged them, I hired and trained the teacher librarian, and I weeded the existing collections that were gathered from the various schools owned by the bands. This is a huge body of land coming down from Lac La Ronge and covering the whole Christopher Lake, Emma Lake area. My undergraduate Native Studies courses served me well. I knew what to keep, those rare books that presented Indigenous peoples without bias or stereotype, and I certainly knew what to discard, those hundreds of books that would not serve the Little Red River School's children and young adults well. Week after week, I filled the recycling bins to overflowing with the discards. I dumped books by well-meaning white people who appropriated Indigenous lives and cultures and created Native protagonists who looked a lot more like objects of social studies than fully developed subjects. Think of it this way. When a story is written about a white child, the child is seen as an individual. So the Native child as individuated subject became the basis of my criteria for the collection. Therefore, I discarded those stories about the Native child that use that child to stereotype, moralize, generalize, objectify, to write about a nation, a people, instead of about a child. So I went books like Whale Brother, that simply had no idea about Inuit life, appalling books like The Indian in the Cupboard, or this series by Bird Baylor. She's probably a nice lady, and her illustrations are gorgeous, but everything else is rubbish. And I happily bin that most heinous of all, the Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and I have often thought it unfortunate that the Osage people did not dismember her when they had the chance. In order to build the library, I spent dozens of hours online and on the phone tracking down appropriate materials. A major help was Doris Seal and Beverly Slapin's Through Indian Eyes, the Native Experience in Books for Children, published in 1987. And everything being connected, because there are First Nations people in my extended family, I had long looked for good books with Indians in them to read to my daughter. Some of the books on her bookshelves were books I kept or acquired for the Little Red River School. And some of those books were by cultural outsiders. I'm not all that biased, actually. By what Claire Bradford, a really good post-colonial critic in children's literature, terms settler society texts. One good example is the work of Canadian children's librarian, he's from Saskatoon, Peter Evanson. Erin, you'll remember some of these books. Through the 1980s and 90s, he published several picture books focusing on everyday issues in contemporary children's lives, and most have Native people in them. Titles like Red Parka Mary, Jen and the Great One, Kookum's Red Shoes, and Kyle's Bath. In Evanson's stories, Indigenous children can find themselves in positive ways. And of course, I bought everything I could find by First Nations authors, and a good deal of what I was acquiring, by now what I think of as the second generation of Indigenous writers for children, because there were Native women in the late 19th century in America publishing retellings of tales from the oral tradition. Most of those stories that I was finding early on were grounded in the oral tradition. Retellings of histories, reworkings of legends, recuperations of origin stories. Among them were books by Mohawk author Joseph Bruchac, by Cherokee Thomas King, and by the Apache Mohawk couple, Michael and Kathleen LaCapa. I remember hunting down the brand new picture book, A Man Called Raven, by Dene author Richard Van Camp, who is often part of the U of A as a guest author in residence. It was one of his first publications, I think his second book. And it was released by Children's Book Press, a non-profit publisher based in San Francisco. For me in PA, hunting that sucker down was quite the feat. Illustrated by George Littlechild, that book was maybe the first time I saw how powerful contemporary retellings of stories from the oral tradition could be, how those stories could offer transformative and enabling ways to understand traditional First Nations social, cultural, and political practices. If, as Silko says, the only way to seek justice is through the power of stories, then stories from the oral tradition seem the right matrix for my women's studies, Native Studies seminar at Queen's, and stories that root themselves in orality, however they do that, as straightforward retellings or as thematic underpinnings to stories set any time after contact, or in some combination of pre- and post-contact narratives, those stories have kept my attention for nearly 20 years now. So imagine my surprise when Thomas King said, and of course many of these stories are historical fiction. And Thomas King said in his 2003 Massey series lectures, the lecture series was titled The Truth About Stories, he said, I quote, "With few exceptions, contemporary Native writers have shown little interest in using the past as setting," end quote. Well, these books say otherwise. And I really like Tom King. Claire Bradford actually echoes this sentiment in her very fine book, Unsettling Narratives. And she focuses on to talk about historical fiction about indigeneity for children. She looks at a book by Orson Scott Card, the Ender's Game guy. I found instead a good deal of historical fiction by Native authors. And there is a prevailing longing in these stories by colonized peoples that does more than simply miss a lost past. A longing that always seemed to me to be proactive and politically motivated. A longing that looks backward, even as it pushes forward past colonization into strategies of sovereignty and survivance. So I'm going to turn now to my new research on nostalgia as resistance in Indigenous children's literature. And this bit will be, I hope, part of an overarching project on Indigenous children's literature and strategies of decolonization. So after this gets kind of worked out a lot better than it is tonight, I want to look at the animal stories. It's exciting, eh? Okay, but I gotta finish this first. All right. Ojibwe writer Louise Erdrich figured prominently in the seminar I taught at Queen's, and she has been a central figure in my teaching here in courses on Native literature, feminist theory, and in several directed readings, and in the graduate course I taught to two of our best and brightest last year. Sam, I see you back there. In her second picture book, The Range Eternal, published in 2005, Erdrich tells a deeply nostalgic tale, one inspired by her grandmother's wood stove. The warm heart of the house, she calls it. As the narrator moves from the past, where a girl growing up on the Turtle Mountain Reserve sees her people's history in the stove's flames, there's the little girl there, and their shadows, to an urban present where the girl, now a young mother, finds her own range eternal and uses it to teach her son, she longs to see the living range restored. Erdrich's nostalgia for a lost history comes through clearly in The Range Eternal, as well as in her other picture book, Grandmother's Pigeon, and especially in her series of children's young adult historical novels about Omakayas, a young Ojibwe girl. Erdrich's narrative nostalgia seems typical as it offers the markers of a linear sense of time, the inadequacies of the present, and a longing for the past, the markers of nostalgia. In fact, it has all the markers of nostalgic fiction that has been much maligned by critics over the past few decades. As one example of that school of thought, I quote Susan Stewart, who argued in 1984 that nostalgia is hostile to history and its invisible origins, and yet longing for an impossibly pure context of lived experience at a place of origin. It wears a distinctly utopian face. Well, the nostalgia in these books for and about First Nations children, I argue, offers its young audience a means of resistance rather than escapism. In Erdrich's hands and those of many other Native authors, the emotional investment of nostalgia finds ways to both honor and integrate specific histories and make them politically and culturally relevant to the present rather than to seek a generic utopia. Svetlana Boym writes that, I quote, "Nostalgia is about the relationship between individual biography and the biography of groups or nations, between personal and collective memory," end quote. Two recent lovely picture books, Fire Dancers by Jan Wayboos and Fox Song by Joseph Bruchak, each intertwine the story of a little girl with that of her grandmother and her people. In the former, the girl called Fast One accompanies her recently widowed Nokomis to an island in northern Ontario for a ritual dance at night, one that brings them into communion with the dead Mishumis, her grandfather, and with the ancestors. In the latter, Janie, this is Fox song, missing her great-grandmother, relives their time outdoors, harvesting birch bark to make baskets, and checking on the maple trees they tap for syrup. After her grandmother dies, the little girl retraces their steps, then sings the morning song they used to sing together while a fox watches. These stories may begin with an individual child missing a dead relative and her nostalgic yearning for that past, but their overarching themes are national in both their emphasis on right relations with the land and appropriate behavior on sovereign territory, and in their reclamation of spiritual and practical traditions. A little closer to home now. In the hands of Cree author Larry Lowy, he's from northern Alberta, and then later I'll talk about Salish author Nicola Campbell from northern BC. Nostalgia for a lost past becomes a looking forward transposed over a looking backward, and looking or seeing is key in these texts. In As Long as the Rivers Flow, Lowy draws from his experience as a residential school survivor, but he doesn't discuss his time in the institution. Instead, he tells the story of his last few months with his family, at their winter home where he and his siblings rear a young owl their father found, and the time at their summer camp, harvesting and preserving their winter food supply of plants and animals. At one point, 10-year-old Lawrence helps his grandmother gather the roots and herbs that comprise her medicines, making sure to offer tobacco to the earth to give thanks for the bounty. They also kill a grizzly bear with a .22, which is no small feat. When they return home, his mother tells the children that they will be taken away to the school soon, as Lowy weaves together the story of the rescued owl and the theme of freedom. When the cattle truck hauls the children away, I quote, "All Lawrence could see was the sky." And the final image in the story, this is the cattle truck picture. The final image in the story shows Lawrence embracing his siblings, turning his gaze inward to them. The story and images thus connect him to home and community, even as he is being removed. And if we follow his gaze, remove him from his present and near future, and beckon toward the freedom that will be his once again. The final image in the book, after Lowy, after the story is done, we have this picture of him with his siblings. The book closes with a picture of their owl flying freely after all of these family photos of the Lowy family when Larry was taken away in 1944. Similarly, in her paired picture books, Shishi Etko and Shinchi's Canoe, Campbell emphasizes the ways in which the child protagonists see themselves and their traditional way of life. Jennifer Ladino argues that nostalgia should not be dismissed as inherently conservative, because it can be a mechanism for social change, a model for ethical relationships, and a motivating force for social and environmental justice. Shishi Etko, whose name means she who loves to play in the water, is a little Salish girl enjoying her last summer at home before she's taken away to residential school. Campbell begins with a headnote, and it's actually a lecture. And it's the only didactic part of these two books, these twinned books. She has this incredibly didactic headnote, and then we have this great story. So she says that about the little girl's people who have always lived in North America, hunting, fishing, and gathering traditional foods and medicines, making their own clothing and building their own houses, making their own rules, and taking care of their traditional territories. End quote. Campbell's introduction clearly is meant to be read to children as a lead-in to the story. She writes that Native children were loved so much that the whole community raised them together. For a long time, the Canadian government believed that Native people were uncivilized and made laws forcing Native children as young as 4 to go to residential school to learn European culture and religion. Parents were put in jail if they didn't send their children to these schools. Can you imagine a community without children? Can you imagine children without parents? End quote. This is not a good bedtime story. Ending at the point where Shishi Etko rides away in the back of yet another cattle truck, the narrative refuses to imagine those things. And I think this is the crucial part of this first book, because it precludes description or discussion of the school and focuses on the child in her place. It ends with this passage and image. At home, the cattle truck that gathered children waited. Shishi Etko picked up her bag of memories, a pinch of tobacco for offering, then went out the back door to her favorite place beneath a great big fir tree. She placed the tobacco at its base, then tucked her bag inside its roots. Dear grandfather tree, please keep my memories and my family safe. I will be home in the spring. End quote. Campbell continues the narrative in Shin-Chi's Canoe, in which Shishi Etko and her little brother spend another wonderful summer with their family, often badgering their father to make them their own dugout canoe, and then are taken to the school together. Only this time we go inside the school. In this book, Campbell makes clear that this is one of the bad schools she describes in her introduction. The text itself says, for half a day they worked, the other half they went to school. The children were never given enough food, end quote. Campbell mediates the poor treatment of the native children with subplots in which Shin-Chi slips away to the river quite often and has adventures with a friend. They steal food. They steal something that they think is going to be sweet and tasty, and it's olives, and they're quite horrified. Where Shishi Etko left her medicine bundle at home, though, when she was taken away, Shin-Chi brings with him a tiny canoe his father carved for him. He holds it at night for comfort. The sweet scent of cedar, the text says, smelled just like his dad. And I suggest these small actions show steady resistance to the pressures to conform to European culture. In looking backward to his past, Shin-Chi also looks ahead to his return home. He knows that when the salmon run again, they'll be going home. And the cover of the book, right here, shows him floating the little canoe downriver, so that by the time he gets home, the salmon will be running and the canoe will be home too. When they do go home at the end of the second book, the children find their father carving them their very own dugout canoe, end quote. These texts are educating settler society children about the residential school system. That's true, it's clear, it's wonderful, it's totally important. But I think they're also engaging in a much more nuanced set of suggestions for their young Native readers. They tell them that the schools have irrevocably changed their home, family, and culture, but they also tell them that they can go home again in some way or other. They can reclaim their spiritual and practical traditions and re-engage with their traditional territories. I think the key moment in each of these books comes right before the children are taken away. Like Lawrence and Loyi's book, Shishi Etko and Shin-Chi pause to see their homes in ways that emphasize their connection to the land and all of its inhabitants. In the first book, Shishi Etko looked at everything, tall grass swaying to the rhythm of the breeze, determined mosquitoes, working bumblebees. She memorized each shiny rock, the sand beneath her feet, and she's very attached to the water. In the second, Shin-Chi looked at everything, the mountain with the trail that led to the caves, the deer in the field by their house. He memorized every fishing spot, the place where he caught the great big frog. Campbell's narrative and Kim Lefebvre's illustrations, and some of you may know Kim Lefebvre as a leading Canadian illustrator of children's picture books. His Amos's sweater is seriously the funniest picture book I've ever read. It's a goat who needs a sweater. These illustrations could place these children in any part of the more than 100-year history of the residential school system in Canada. The narrative and illustrative indeterminacy might set the stories early in this history, but it's hard to tell. Campbell's head note to Shin-Chi's Canoe looks both back and ahead as she notes that, I quote, residential schools resulted in a devastating loss of Native traditions, languages, and cultures. The effects of the residential school system continue to hurt Native people. It is said that it will take 7 generations for our people to heal, end quote. Boyum argues that reflective nostalgia does not follow a single plot, but explores ways of inhabiting many places at once and imagining different time zones. It loves details, not symbols." End quote. The details of Lefebvre's artwork both imagine and inhabit many places. Those details, you can see with that family, offer what could be a Salish family in 1910, a Cree family in 1940, or a Chippewa family in 1970. But both artwork and narrative offer Indigenous responses to the residential school system that counter the harm and set a foundation for healing. And foundation is key here, and in one of Lydia's talks this week, she talked about the triangle, and you can see here that the broad base point of the house, that this is a stable, loving family. This isn't going away, even though the children are being removed. Like Loyi and Campbell, Louise Erdrich uses the longing for all that has been lost in ways that show Native children how to understand their collective history and how to use it to form identity and means of resistance. Before moving to Kingston, we lived in Prince Albert, a city of 35,000 people with a Native majority. So I love it that both of Erdrich's picture books take care to place a historical moment in a contemporary urban setting and in the hands of children, and thereby offer a story for urban Native children. There's a whole lot of them. I'll start with Grandmother's Pigeon. In this picture book, a seemingly ordinary grandmother sails away on the back of a congenial porpoise to tour the world and see Greenland. She leaves behind a room chock-a-block full of treasures, among them a stuffed pigeon and its nest. When Mother picks up the nest, the eggs begin to hatch. The windows are shut, but the stuffed pigeon, who, I quote, usually wore a sad expression, looked very pleased with itself. Young readers are encouraged to embrace the narrative's magical realism as the children in the story care for the three hatchlings, feeding them, I quote, a food that resembles pigeon's milk. The family calls in an ornithologist who identifies the squabs, that's the word for baby pigeons, as passenger pigeons. This is what the story says. Once upon a time, these birds were so abundant that they traveled in flocks that took 3 days to pass overhead. 300 million birds per hour. Their nesting colonies sometimes stretched 40 miles long. They seemed limitless as leaves. The lesson they teach is this: nature is both tough and fragile. Greed destroyed them. They were killed for food by the millions, and their nesting trees were burned. The last known pigeon, whose name was Martha, died in 1914 in the Cincinnati Zoo, end quote. After being plagued by scientists and reporters, the family discusses the pigeons, who are all boys. Father thinks they should be studied, but then he looks at them. He really looks at them. Their expressions were dull and weary. They didn't hop about or ruffle their feathers. They didn't gurgle, hadn't the strength to coo. Their listless eyes changed Father's mind completely, end quote. With their parents' tacit consent, the children set the pigeons free after taping messages for their grandmother on the birds' legs. Saying goodbye. They get a letter in return promising that she will come back soon. And that's it. In the imagined past, history and nostalgia, Christopher Shaw and Malcolm Chase negotiate between the view of nostalgia as an appropriation, a cultural phenomenon that told us about the present through its falsification of the past, and as an encounter with the past which is represented in the present through activities and practices, through ritual and ceremony, and through ideas and beliefs. Grandmother's Pigeon might appropriate the past, at least the history of the passenger pigeon, and it may add an aura of falsification through the sheer improbability of the passenger's return. But its encounter with the past, while ideological, is also heuristic and environmentalist. In Reclaiming Nostalgia, Jennifer Ladino points out that the past has a material, geographical reality as well as an ideological and narrative one. If nostalgic longing takes nature as an object, then there are material components that must be accounted for, even if those components have been altered over time. In order to grasp the ideological dimensions of nostalgia, we need to attend to the environmental dimensions as well. Grandmother's Pigeon looks to the natural world and accounts for its material components, first with the species destroyed by imperialism. And while the book insists on an emotional investment in the lost passenger, the squabs stand in for a missing and beloved grandmother, and they are lovely in these paintings. It also precludes their magical return. The 3 young pigeons are all male. Instead of investing its emotive force in something that cannot happen, the narrative ties together its ideological and environmental dimensions to grandmother and her actions. When she writes, she exhorts the children to take good care of her stuffed pigeon, implying that more miracles may be at hand. And those miracles may come about through her connections to the natural world in the present, the porpoises and whales that give her rides. The only other animals mentioned or depicted in the book, these cetaceans are under extreme pressure from human greed. Every species in this order, which also includes dolphins, is protected. Many are endangered, and the vaquita porpoise, the first one that gives Grandma a ride, is the most endangered marine animal today. Overall, nostalgia functions alongside environmentalism as, synecdochically, the passengers stand in for all extinct species and the cetaceans for those in danger. The children, who are the book's primary audience, and their parents, one expects, are thus greatly encouraged to consider human damage to the natural world. I suggest that the book just as gently comments on the effects of colonization on North America's first peoples. While Grandmother's Pigeon in no way defines its unnamed characters as indigenous, there are hints that Erdrich has attached them to her nation and its tradition. The dark-haired, dark-eyed children, the attachment to herbal remedies, and the mother who looks pretty much exactly like Erdrich herself. Further, as with her vast catalog of novels for adults, the rest of her books are centered on Native Americans. And as with her fiction for adults, these narratives contemplate what has been lost, even as they encourage their